In this lesson, we'll take a look at the sun, sky, and camera setup for an interior scene in Rhino. Let's get a feel for our scene by starting an interactive render. You'll notice that our scene is dark and no direct light enters the room. Let's change that by adding a V-Ray sun. From the V-Ray toolbar, click on the V-Ray sun tool to select it. As soon as you do that, you will be prompted to select the time of day settings, such as the date of the month. You can also pick a geographical location from the list over here. Additionally, there's a manual control checkbox in order to set the sun's position manually. Now click OK, and let's position the sun in the scene. Switching to the top view, just click once and the sun will be positioned based on the settings we chose. Optionally, you can use the rotate tool to change the direction of the sunlight to your satisfaction. Now that the V-Ray sun is positioned in the scene, let's open up the asset editor and go to the settings. Here where it says Environment, drop down the menu and click the checkbox for Background. Next, click on the small checker icon, and from the menu, choose Sky. Then, drop down this menu here and choose Sunlight to link the V-Ray sun to the V-Ray sky. Now let's exit from this menu and go back to the main settings. Let's make some additional changes to the brightness of the image by expanding the camera options. Enable the exposure option and drop down the menu to adjust the exposure value. As we saw in Lesson 2, moving the slider to the left darkens the image and moving it to the right brightens it. For our purposes, let's set the exposure value to 12.5. Since we have a warmer light coming in, we can counteract that by adjusting the white balance to neutralize the warmth. Slide it to a warmish yellow color, or set the color manually like so. Beneath the white balance, there is also an effects setting. Twirl that open and you'll see a parameter called vertical tilt. As we also saw in Lesson 2, slide this to the left or to the right to skew the tilting of the vertical edges in your image. Let's go ahead and set the tilt to 0.1 to straighten up all the vertical lines in the image. Now, let's go back to the Lights tab and take a look at what options we have for the V-Ray sunlight by dropping down this menu. We're currently using the default sky model of HOSEC, which is generally the preferred method, but I'd like a little more control here. Click on HOSEC to choose from a list of other sky models, and let's use the CIE Clear option. Notice that this enables the horizontal illumination slider, which allows us to control the brightness of the sky itself. For example, if you move the slider to the left, notice how the sky darkens. Set the sky to 0, and the sky will go black, meaning it is turned off. And if you slide it to the right, the sky brightens. On the other hand, the sun's brightness doesn't change. Notice that we also have very hard shadows here. To fix this, we need to adjust the size multiplier for the sun. Let's dial the multiplier up to 20 and see how that looks. Okay, I think we're ready for the next step. In this lesson, we're going to discuss portal lights. We're nearly done setting up the lighting in the scene, but there's one more thing that we can do to help, and that is to add portal lights to all of the openings here. Let's stop the render and then close both the frame buffer and the asset editor. Next, let's navigate to the outside of the model, and then choose a V-Ray rectangle light from the V-Ray toolbar. Now, draw a plane on a vertical surface somewhere in the scene. Once the light is drawn, select and move the rectangle light so that it's in line with the opening here. The arrow of the rectangle light should be facing the interior of the house. Then, repeat these steps for the other openings. Once we have lights for each opening, click on the render view scene to get back inside. Now let's go ahead and start an interactive render. You'll notice that the scene begins to render with artificial light flooding through. That's because we still have to set these lights to be portal lights. To do that, go to the V-Ray Asset Editor, and in the Lights tab, click on the rectangle light, and make sure the right-hand menu is open. To be sure that these rectangle lights are working as you would expect, you can change the color. Try picking something bright, and notice how it affects the render. The lights are now casting a lot of bright light into the scene. However, there's a more realistic approach we can use, where each light takes into account the outside environment. We can achieve this effect by switching on the portal light setting. Notice how the render immediately changes. No longer do you see the previous light color, but now we see an amplification of the real light behind the windows. Notice that the portal light mode is also set to simple. When you click on the drop-down arrow, you'll see that you have two different options, simple or accurate. Simple will just take the skylight and amplify it, whereas accurate will take objects from behind the portal light and factor them into the illumination as well. The simple method is faster, and since we don't have anything else behind the windows anyway, this method will suit our needs. Note that once the portal light option is turned on, the intensity of the lights and color will not affect your render result. The portal lights will simply act as an amplification of the outside light. Now let's go ahead and stop the interactive render. In the frame buffer, I want to see the effect of the portal lights on the render result. Expand the History tab, and let's navigate here to the History settings, and choose the Assets folder. Notice we have one render where it says Portal Lights Off, and one that says Portal Lights On. These will give you a preview comparison of what the render looks like with or without the portal lights setting. Notice how much brighter the scene looks with the portal lights on. Switching between the two renders should give you a better understanding of the difference the portal lights setting can make. Now that we've got our lighting all set, let's take a look at some of our settings for rendering. First, let's close the History tab and return to the V-Ray Asset Editor. Now in the Settings tab, drop down the Renderer section, and let's take a look at some of the options here. Specifically, let's review the Global Illumination settings by clicking on the menu to expand them. Global illumination is very important for interiors because it computes the illumination that comes from bounced light in the scene. Notice that we have only one parameter here we can affect. It's also dependent on which render engine we use. Let's switch off Interactive, which turns on Progressive, and notice that we now have more controls here. For calculating the primary and secondary rays, the brute force and light cache combination is the preferred method for rendering an interior. However, if we're still trying to get a feel for how our render will look, we may want to choose render settings that will render faster. In this case, let's flip down the primary rays menu option and instead choose a radiance map. This is an adaptive version of the brute force engine, which typically produces faster results. However, keep in mind that it can also produce splotchy renders, so it's really best used just for draft purposes. Let's also leave the secondary rays option set to light cache, which is especially useful for illuminating interiors. Now, let's head over here to where the quality slider says medium, and move it down all the way to draft. These settings will now work great for a fast draft. So let's go ahead and hit render. The first GI pass calculated was for the light cache, and the second pass that used the buckets was for the irradiance map. As you saw, it rendered fairly quickly, but the quality is not all that great. Go ahead and open up the History tab, and let's save this image so that we can compare results later. Next, let's change the quality for another render. Switch the quality from draft to medium. Now, hit render. You can see that this took much longer to render. Go ahead and save this image to the history as well. Now, if you set it up to do an A-B comparison, you'll notice the difference between the draft quality and the medium quality right away. Let's go back over to the settings and for primary rays, revert it back to brute force. Now, clear the A-B comparison and close the History tab, and let's move on to the next step. In this lesson, we're going to turn our attention to materials. Let's start by adding materials for the bigger surfaces, since they will have the most impact on the global illumination of the space. First, let's talk about the glass material for the windows. Go to your V-Ray Asset Editor and click on the Materials tab, where you will see Glass. Then let's close the frame buffer. Now, fly out this menu here, and in the Categories section, you will see there is a glass folder. Click on that, and down in the library below, we'll see a list of glass materials available. For the windows, I have already applied the plain glass material. I simply drag the glass into the material list ahead of time. That way, we can immediately see the light shine through. There is something to note about the glass material though. If I rotate in the scene and get a close-up view on the glass windows, you can see that there is a thickness applied to the window itself, rather than just being a simple plane. This thickness I've added is important for the glass refraction properties to work, so that light passing through refracts properly. Okay, now let's return to the original render scene view. Next, we'll add some wood to the floor. Over in the Asset Editor, make sure you're in the Material list, and from the left-hand menu, scroll down the categories to find the Wood and Laminate folder. Let's pick the Flooring Parquet Parallel H01 120 cm material by dragging it into the Material list. Then, let's select the floor and right-click the material and choose Apply to Selection. Don't forget that there is also a scale associated with these textures, so you'll want to fix that back over in Rhino as we covered before. Let's go to the texture mapping and set the scale. Next, let's test this out with a render. But first, let's change some settings so that we can preview the scene faster. I'll set the quality slider down to draft mode, and make sure we're in the progressive rendering mode here so that we can see the global illumination. Remember that we can also change the primary rays to a radiance map in order to get a good draft setting. And let's go ahead and click Render. Okay, now that our image is ready, let's save it in the History section, then close the frame buffer. Now let's try out another wood material on the floor. Back over in the Asset Editor, go to the Materials tab again, fly out the menu to the left, and then scroll through the library until you find a darker wood. I'm going to go with this Flooring Laminate F Narrow 250 cm option here. Again, drag it into the material list, make sure your floor is selected, and then right-click and choose Apply to Selection. The material is also associated with a scale, so we need to update the scale back in the Texture Mapping tab. Once we have done that, go ahead and close the left-hand flyout menu, and let's re-render the scene to compare the difference. Okay, go ahead and save this image to the history as well. Now, if you preview them side by side using the A-B comparison, notice that not only the color changes, but also the color bleeding on the walls changes as a result of the global illumination. This is what happens in the real world when light bounces back off colored surfaces and hits nearby surfaces. This also demonstrates how the effect of global illumination can greatly impact the realism of lighting interiors. Now, let's close the History tab and also close the frame buffer, and let's change the wood one last time. In the Asset Editor, open the left flyout menu and scroll through the library menu until you find Veneer D02 120 cm. Drag it into the material list and right-click and choose Apply to Selection. Once more, don't forget to change the scale. Next, back over in the asset editor, this button here is for purging unused materials. Let's go ahead and click on that to get rid of those other wood materials that we've been trying out but no longer need. The next set of big surfaces we want to take care of are the walls. Go ahead and select one wall, and then in the V-Ray Asset Editor, under the Materials tab, fly out the menu and go to the Wall Paint and Wallpaper folder. In the search field, let's type Fine and then choose the Wall Paint Fine Grain 01 White 1 meter material and drag it over into our material list. Now, make sure the wall is selected and right-click to apply to selection. Once more, let's adjust the scale. Finally, let's change the diffuse color of this material by clicking on the color swatch. Using the RGB sliders, let's set all three of them to 220. Lastly, before we render, let's repeat these steps for the remaining walls in our model. Okay, now let's go ahead and re-render. And now we're ready for the next step. With all of the lighting and materials now ready, let's go ahead and prepare for a high-quality render. In the V-Ray Asset Editor, go to the Settings tab, and let's start by setting the resolution for our render under the Render Output. Be cognizant that the larger the resolution, the longer it will take for the image to render. As a result, it's important to choose settings that work best for your computer's hardware. In my case, I'll settle on 1200 by 960. Now let's switch off both interactive and progressive modes so that we're using bucket mode. For the quality setting, let's drag the slider to high. Fly out the menu to the right to see a few more options. Under global illumination, let's make sure that for the primary rays, we're using brute force. Now, down in the render elements section, let's also click to add a render element. Go ahead and add the denoiser element. The denoiser will help us remove noise from the final image, since we're using high quality instead of the very high setting. Let's see what options we have if we expand the denoiser setting. You'll see that there's a preset. Flip that menu down so that we can set the strength of the denoiser. Be aware that if you go too strong, you'll lose some details. Since we're already using a quality setting of high, the mild preset here should do the trick. Let's now add one more render element, the material ID. The material ID will assign a color to each different material that can be used later in a post-processing software like Photoshop for compositing. It amounts to a mask around every material that we can use later on to more easily make adjustments to those individual materials separately. The color that the material ID assigns can also be set manually if you'd like in the Materials tab. Click on any material that's been used, and in the flyout menu to the right, scroll down, click on the Options tab, and then in the Color tab, you'll see the ID color. You can switch it to something you'd prefer. There's no need to go through it and change all the ID colors, so I'm going to leave the rest to their default state. Now, when you're all set, go ahead and click Render. And there you have it. You've got your final render. Let's touch on a few things here. First, you'll notice here in the upper left corner that the final render is named Effects Result. This is because the Effects Result channel represents the final image after any effects have been applied to it. Now, zoom in a bit on the render, and let's drop down the Render Elements menu so that we can confirm that the denoiser was applied to the Effects Result channel. Flip back and forth between the RGB channel and the denoiser channel to see the difference with the applied denoiser. We can also drop down the menu to see what the Material ID element looks like. See how the different colors are applied to each of the different materials. Lastly, let's go back to the Effects Result channel and apply some basic color corrections.